the South is very strange.
So I'm
So
getting that impression. Yeah.
so you're getting, yeah, absolutely. All right, well, let's get started, and then I'll let you on your way. Um, let me get things together. Welcome to Tactical Faith. This is Matt Burford. I am joined today with a gentleman that I just was introduced to, but we have been talking to with each other lately over emails, and he is coming to the Deep South for us here in October. He's going to be joined with Rod Dreher and a couple of other speakers to do what I think is a really neat kind of opportunity for us. You know, at Tactical Faith, I always make a point to saying that we're a volunteer organization that's trying to get the Deep South and especially Alabama to think deeply about the Christian worldview. And part of that is having this ecumenical spirit where we kind of, we look around kind of the church at large and trying to find what are people talking about? What are the Christian intellectuals speaking about and writing about? And I would say a couple of years ago, I picked up either a Touchstone or First Things magazine, I can't remember, and I read an article about resisting the machine by a man named Paul Kingsnorth, and it really kind of struck with me that he has something great to say. And then when I was talking to Rod Dreher, my friend Rod, about some things, I noted the article to him, and he said, "Oh, this man has his finger on the pulse of something that's going to be edge, kind of edge of the spear, touch, tip of the spear kind of issues when it comes to not only Western Christianity, but just globally what we're dealing with." So I reached out to him, and luckily I was able to talk him into coming to the Deep South, and I don't think you've been before, right? Have you ever been to the Deep South?
This is going to be my first trip to the South. Yes.
Oh man. Well, I
I'm
hope
already
as you,
slightly nervous, I have to
yeah,
say.
you should be nervous. You should be absolutely
Yes.
nervous.
So
Uh,
I feel, yes.
well, let me just get straight to it. Give me a little bit of your background. When I was doing a little research for you, one of the things that struck out for me, and I think it's kind of fun, I teach a class on kind of what it's kind of a great books class where we go through all Western great books and thoughts, and I get college students to think. And one of the things that we talk about is in Plato's Republic is Socrates saying you need to be a gadfly. In other words, you need to cause a little bit of trouble, you know. And I did notice that you were, I think it said somewhere here that you were a top 10 troublemaker. You were named top 10 troublemaker in the New Statesman's magazine in 2001. That's
Mm,
awesome
that's
to
awesome.
me.
I mean,
It,
that's a very long time ago. I'm much better behaved now, of course. Uh,
But tell me a
yeah.
little bit about your background. What is it about you possibly even being a gadfly or in the sense of maybe pushing it back against what you see are problems in the Western world?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I've been called a gadfly before that. I don't know if that's good or bad.
Well,
I think my whole life and my whole career have been a sort of pushing back against the culture I'm in, which I've just never felt comfortable with for ways it's impossible for reasons it's impossible to explain. And so my fate seems to be
hmm,
to be able to sit here for better or for worse. Yeah, analyzing that, looking at that, saying, what's wrong with this picture? Because something's wrong with it. I mean, my background is I'm English. I live in Ireland now. I grew up near London, which is where my family came from. Had quite a normal upbringing, I suppose, suburban upbringing. Um, Spent a lot of time when I was young with my dad walking across the wild places of Britain, which made me a great nature lover. Went to university in the 90s, went to Oxford University, became very politicized, as students tend to do. Um, Became very much an environmentalist there. This was back in the 90s. There was a big environmental movement going in Britain to protect the remaining parts of the countryside which were being built on and having roads driven through them and the rest of it. So I could see something going on that was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. And it turned out that the more I thought about this, the more I read, the more I experienced the world, I felt like we didn't have the language to talk about what was being lost. And I
hmm.
think that's been a thread that goes all the way through my work. And I've always been as a writer trying to find what that language is. Because if we were to look at the natural world, for example, I think most of us would say that if we walk into a forest, something inexplicable happens to us. There's an experience that we can have in the wild places of the world, or certainly that I've had anyway, that can't be rationalized or explained or put into numbers or quantified. And what that means is that the society we're living in now doesn't accept that it exists. And so I suppose that the short version of the next 20 or 30 years of my life is that I spent a lot of time as a writer. I've always been a reader, I've always been a writer, I've always wanted to write. And writing things down is just the way that I work out what to think about the world, or work my way through it. And I came to see that I think that we are living in a time in which society is so heavily rationalistic, so left brain, so technological, so quantifiable, that many of the things that our ancestors would have recognized as important, and actually we still do, cannot be explained in the language of the time.
Hmm.
So you can't explain why you love nature. You can't explain why a culture might matter. You can't explain why a religion might be important. You can't explain anything that actually matters to you in the way that the modern world effectively has come to explain the world. And so we're living in a culture, particularly in the West, and it's a culture the West invented, really, so it's our fault. It's been around at least since the Enlightenment, in which we are almost seeing the world as a machine, and the world is
Mhm.
seeing us as a machine. And this image of a machine, which I have found in endless numbers of poets and novelists and filmmakers all the way through the 20th century, in fact, since the Industrial Revolution, is an image for me that explains where we're going. We're turning ourselves and our society into this technological manifestation of this very rational way of seeing, which excludes a lot of other things that actually matter. And I think it's enormously culturally and ecologically and spiritually destructive. So that's really been the story I've been telling forever. I think writers just have one story they're telling, and however hard they try and get away from it, they end up just going back to it in whatever form. And so I've written novels and I've written poetry and I've written non-fiction books. And they always like circle around this sense that we are somehow trying to remain human in this machine world.
Have you ever tried to teach Aristotle to somebody?
I have never tried to do that. No, I would. I need it taught
So,
to me probably.
so the reason I say that is because I've just gone through Aristotle's Ethics with the three classes that I have at Samford University. And when I start talking about the good, the idea that Plato and Aristotle talk, I've noticed it's incredibly frustrating. And it's the hardest classes that I teach. And I left yesterday when I taught this so frustrated because the concept of the good, from an ancient standpoint, they're seeing it in a different framework than we are. So my students are definitely modern. They're Christian. Now, this is a Christian university, but they import all this modernist, legalistic definitions, and they want specifics. They're like, Dr. Burford, give me a specific. What are you talking about? And when they talk about the good, it reminds me of what you're saying. It's like I can't get too frustrated with them because they lack a framework to understand fully what Aristotle's trying to say. So he's trying to move them to become somebody, right? Is the way that I look at it. But reading your work and reading your Substack, I'm constantly just reminded that we lack, even as Christians, a framework to see the good, right? And we want specificity. We want specifics. We want to evaluate it like it's a math formula. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Uh,
it does exactly. And I think um it's as I say, I think maybe what I've tried to do, and I don't know that I've ever really managed to do it because I'm probably not qualified, but I've been trying to find words to explain how to explain the things that our culture doesn't give us the language to explain. So it's a challenge. But I think in a way that's what all poets are doing, and what many
right.
musicians are doing, what novelists are doing. It's kind of what they've always been doing. So it's an ancient task. It's the kind of duty to, and the reason that maybe it's the duty of a gadfly is that somebody has to sit to some degree on the edge of things and point into the center and say, look, this is what's missing here. And to some degree, writers, I think, and artists are always doing that. But that's what we're missing now. We're missing that those maybe assumptions that ancient cultures would have had much less trouble understanding than we do, that we've rationalized away and mechanized away.
So when you say we're missing it, but it's not like you're saying people don't know that it exists. Are we missing the language, even reflective language, to understand what that is?
It does feel like that, doesn't it? It also feels like we're missing being given permission to talk about it almost.
Right,
You know,
right.
it's like there are some things we don't have permission to talk about. So here's an interesting fact. And since Rod Dre is a friend of yours, he's probably been talking to you about this because it's what his new book's about to some degree. Um, think about beliefs in the supernatural. Think about belief in ghosts or experiences that people have had of weird supernatural things happening. Huge numbers of people actually have had these experiences, probably majorities throughout cultures. I've been reading about that sort of stuff for years because I find it fascinating. But people won't really talk about it unless you kind of sit them down in private. And then they'll say, yeah, you know, this weird thing happened to me. And then we get into the kind of fireside stories. But there's no
Mm.
permission to talk about something like that because the culture would regard it as ridiculous. And so we just don't. And I think the same is true of religious experiences, people having experiences of God on a repeated basis. They don't know what that is or what it means or what to do with it. And even in, as you say, modern versions of the Christian religion and maybe other religions too, we don't really know how to talk about that. We don't talk about evil. We don't talk about the devil. We don't talk about all these embarrassing old fashioned sort of things that actually have always been at the
Right.
heart of these worldviews. I used to be a Buddhist before I was a Christian on my long spiritual journey. And it's interesting to me that even Buddhism in the West is very rationalized. It's turned
Mm.
into almost a kind of sensible. It's a religion for middle class liberals, you know, who don't like don't like anything that's a bit too woo. I used to be like that. But if you actually look at the teachings of Buddhism where it comes from, it's full of hungry ghosts and demons and layers of hell and all sorts of strange things that we don't want to talk about. So it's as if we have had drained out of us probably since the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment or some period like that, perhaps even earlier. We've had drained out of us this the language and the permission to talk about the strange things that we actually experience in our lives, but we still experience them. But we haven't really got anywhere to go with them. It's like, say, you fell in love with someone, but society didn't accept that love existed. And so
Mm.
you had this enormous feeling, but you didn't know what to do with it or how to explain it or whether you were even allowed to talk about it. It feels a bit like that.
Yeah,
So it's not as if we've changed. We're still having the same experiences, I think, in many ways, but we can't or won't or aren't able to actually work out what to do with the feeling.
yeah, that's brilliant. So when I go and teach in churches, so I teach in the area of theology and apologetics when I'm outside of university, and one of the ways that I'm trying to get people to understand kind of where you're coming from is, and it's especially hard in the Baptist world, which dominates the state that I live in, and I'm an ordained Southern Baptist minister as well. Um, it's this kind of we've imported like this modernist view and framework even on our religious experiences, like you say. But one of the things that I try to do is I try to get husbands and wives to think about their spouses. You just mentioned that to a degree about love, and I say, would you find it strange that, if all I talked about when it comes to my wife is her hair color, her eye color, how tall she was, the date we were married, and I constantly talk to her in those kind of ways. Now, those things are important, right? Because if you see me out on a date with somebody that doesn't comport with the details, then of course you're like, something's amiss. But you're going to question my something deeper if that's the only way I talk about my wife. If I, if you notice that I talk about my wife in a glowing way or even in almost a poetic way, we get a sense of that's more real. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
And
exactly. Yeah.
I'm trying to pull people out of wherever they are, and including myself there. And I'm constantly reminded by your work, where G.K. Chesterton said, a mathematician tries to get heaven into his head, but a poet tries to get his head into heaven, right?
Mhm.
And that's this ongoing kind of idea that has really changed the way that I have viewed and reflected on my own life over the last 10 or so years. And I think that's what your work resonates with me. It's almost like red pilling to a degree. And just calling people back to a conversation and even a framework, medieval, even younger than that. Even the ancients, they have a way about which they talk about things that seem more real. So in my world, if you talk about Genesis 1, people go, in the beginning, God created. And then they want to talk about and argue over what days and hours of creation. Is it 24-hour literal? Is it eon? Whatever, but I'm always like, man, you didn't stop at the most important part, in the beginning, God. And, and that's the most important part to me. So we're missing that. And I think by bringing you here, I'm hoping, especially your work. Like I just got through with one of your books, and they're difficult. I'll be honest with you, they're difficult for somebody like me that's not used to that kind of, way of reading. But at the same time, it's eye opening, right? For reflection upon myself. So why did you use the medium of, let's just say, fiction? Because your fiction writing is brought you a lot of notoriety. But what is your goal in fiction writing? Is it to open up, people's ideas to some new way of looking or thinking?
Well, I don't think you can really have a goal in fiction writing like that. I think you have to be very
Okay,
careful not to write a novel with a point you're trying to make, because then it's
sure,
just didactic stuff. So I've never done that. But of course, the novels I write are my novels, so they have my worldview in. That's
right.
the case with any writer. That's obviously what's happening. I was writing novels before I was writing non-fiction. Actually, I wrote two novels which were never published, thankfully, in retrospect. But that was the thing I did first, and it's probably the thing I enjoy most. I'm probably better known for all of my non-fiction writing at the moment, but non-fiction writing, I mean, the ironic thing about that is you end up using your left brain to analyze why your culture is too left brain. So you got to
Right,
be careful. You
right.
can get very stuck in that, and there's a lot of it around at the moment. Um, I just like to tell stories. That's what writers do. And even in my non-fiction writing, I'm telling stories. So I'll write a novel when a story comes to me, or I get fascinated enough by something that I have to write it down. But then, of course, as I say, all of my all of my obsessions and convictions will come into it. So the reason that my fiction is difficult, despite me constantly attempting to write something mainstream and accessible, it just never works. It's, I'm fascinated by language, and so my novels. I don't do this really with my nonfiction in the same way, but with my novels, I give myself permission to break the language apart, because the language we use to speak about everything is the key to understanding the way that we see the world, obviously. So my first book, my first novel, for example, was based in the 11th century. It was written
Right.
about the Norman conquest of England, and I started writing that in conventional English, and I quickly realized it didn't work because I had an Anglo-Saxon farmer speaking 21st century English, and it's absurd. It's the equivalent of giving him a cappuccino and an iPad. It wasn't going to work. So I had to end up inventing my own version of Old English that modern people might just about be able to read. And it was a kind of suicidal project in a way. I didn't think it would ever get published, but I enjoyed it. So I wrote it. Weirdly enough, it's one of my most successful books, which probably ought to tell me something. But the way that we speak, the language that we use, is part and parcel of the what we were just talking about, the way that we see the world and the permission we give ourselves to see it, because the language we've constructed to talk about the world and to talk about people, if you can't break that open, you can't change the way you see.
You're
Because
right.
if you start to listen to the way that people are referred to and the world is referred to in the discourse at the moment, you can see this machine. So how many times have you heard a human being called a consumer? You watch the news, we're just called consumers, or maybe we're called voters. What does that mean? We just think people that do things. Look at the way that we talk about what a Christian would call creation. Okay, there's great, astonishing complexity of nature. We call it the environment. Or
Right.
we talk about a thing called biodiversity. And these are kind of technological or technical descriptions of things that belong in scientific papers that don't belong in human conversations. The minute you
Right.
talk about an environment, you've
Right.
completely desold everything that lives out in the forest. No old culture would talk about the environment. It's meaningless. Even the word nature is quite meaningless because it separates us out from everything else in a way that makes it feel as if we don't belong to it. So you have all of these ways of referring to people and society and the world around us, which actually dehumanize us. You have to interrogate the language as a writer of your society at any one time. And when you start to interrogate our language, you see it's a machine-like language. It's a language that makes us look at people and look at machines as if we were living in a giant computer program, and we were just we have sort of consuming and producing parts to pay in that. And again, the things that are quantified and explained are the things we can measure. We can't talk about the things that we can't measure.
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's almost as if our superpower is to apply context and meaning to the universe. That's what I always say. Like the image, being an image bearer, part of that is being able to give meaning to things. So when Adam named the animals, people just kind of think that he's just categorizing him. Giving something a
Mm.
name gives it meaning. And I've always
Mm.
taken from that the idea that our superpower as humans is to be able to give meaning to things. And what you're teaching me is part of that superpower is our language, right? And if I have a certain only a certain way by which I can define the things around me, in a lot of ways, there's a cosmic loss to that, right?
Mm. I
Um,
think there is, and I think it's a language that's developed out of this machine-like way of seeing the world.
huh,
Um, there's a writer called Ian McGilchrist. You might have heard of him. I know Rod Dreher's a big fan of his. He wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, and he's written an enormous 2-volume book since then, which is it's far too complex for a normie like me to understand, but it's his life's work. But his case in many ways is quite simple, that the left and the right hemisphere of the brain have different ways of seeing and understanding the world. The right, he says that the what does he say? He says that the right hemisphere comprehends, the left hemisphere apprehends. So you have a division in your mind, and it's a literal biological division as well as a kind of philosophical one, between the part of your mind that can rationalize and explain things, which is the left hemisphere. And that's the part of your mind that creates machines and categorizes things and builds science and technology and the rest of it. And then you have the right side of your brain, which can see the bigger picture. And the point about this division is we need both of those things at once, and that the left side is supposed to be in service to the right side. So the side of you that can see the really big picture of life and what Earth is and what the meaning of a human being is and what God is, all of these things. That's supposed to be served by the side of your consciousness that can categorize and rationalize and argue and create. Those are useful skills. But what's happened is effectively the left hemisphere has staged a coup and defeated the right hemisphere and taken over. And now we have a world which is basically
mm,
run by the machine-like part of our consciousness,
mm,
which might be a useful part to have because it allows us to do things like, building or creating medical systems or all of the things that are useful to us. But when that becomes our only way of seeing, which it pretty much has done, the only official way of seeing anyway in the Western world, we're in for big trouble because we fail to actually understand what the world is. We can only see part of it, and then we imagine that part that we can see is the whole. And I have a feeling that that's where we are. And then when you get to that point, eventually reality starts breaking through because
right.
you're not seeing the whole of reality. So we're in this weird point in Western culture at the moment where in many ways we're very triumphant, but also we can feel everything's falling apart. And we don't really know what that is. And I think it's reality breaking back through again.
Yeah, it's a story of
Think it's
Babel.
all the things that we were not given permission to speak about and we don't know
Right.
how to talk about are all kind of crowding in on us.
So it's the story of Babel. It's the we have a language confusion to some degree.
It's definitely part of it, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested in Genesis. It's such an interesting story. That's like the whole of human life is there, and
Right.
the kind of decision to choose knowledge over communion with God, and what that leads
Absolutely.
to. That leads to a falling away of your connection to God, but also your connection to the rest of creation, because it's not until the fall that everything starts killing everything else and eating everything else,
Right.
and then we start to build cities, and then we get murder, and then we get metalwork, and then we get farming and civilization, and then we get building towers back up to heaven. And it's like we've separated ourselves out from the actual source of meaning and the source of truth. And so we use our technologies and our weapons and our cities and our towers to try and get back to it again. But we're using the wrong part of our brain. So when you try and build a Tower of Babel literally up to heaven, it's a very kind of rationalistic attempt to get back to God again. But it doesn't work because God isn't at the top of a tower anyway.
Yeah,
It's the only way we can comprehend trying to get back to what we dimly know that we've lost. I'm really
that's
also
beautiful.
very interested in the fact that a lot of different cultures have some sort of mythology that tells them that at the beginning things were broken. This is a Christian story. Obviously, it's in Genesis, but there's a lot of other cultures as well that have this notion of a golden age and can also sense that dimly things used to be more connected than they are.
Yeah.
So it's not a
Hesiod Hesiod does that. You
mm,
remember Hesiod does that in Works and Days. His eras of man. They
right.
start off glorious and then they make this
Mm,
they
the golden
decline
age, the
down.
iron age. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not as if it's the Christians and the Jews who are the only people who've noticed this. There's
Right.
a kind of deterioration, but we're in an age now where I think probably there hasn't been a culture that's seen the world in quite the way we have before.
Ah,
That's one of the things I'm really interested in at the moment is I can't think of another culture that I know of from history that's never had a spiritual core, that's never seen God, that's never had a religious understanding at its core, even though those religions would have been very different and their understandings about God or the gods would have been different. Even the Roman Empire at its height is a religious culture,
Right.
but we're not. We're a culture that says that area of life is not real and it's irrelevant. And if you want to do it in private on Sunday, that's fine, but it's got nothing to do with reality. But if that is reality, then it breaks back in, of course.
Oh man, we're gonna have so much fun. We could talk forever, but I want to be kind to your time. So you're coming in October. You're going to be sharing. We're going to be sharing these kind of ideas together. I can't wait. You're just the kind of guy that I want to hang around and I think it's the
We haven't
last.
met me yet, so let's
No,
we decide afterwards.
maybe not in flesh, but I've read enough of your work. When I finished the Beast, so I read Beast this summer on my way to California, which is a whole nother story. But after, so I started it in the morning, and by the time I got to California, I almost finished it. And I had such a great time reading it that I thought at that point I thought I'm gonna really enjoy you. I'm gonna enjoy you being in the South. I'm gonna enjoy introducing you to here because the South is very haunted in a lot of ways with religion and our culture. Even though it's disappearing to a degree, we still kind of have places and spaces where we talk about strange things because we're strange people. I mean, I'm just going to be honest with you. We're very odd and strange people, but I love them. And we're going to look forward to having you here. Thank you so much for what you do. Thank you so much for your transparency and your ability and openness. You have a Substack. What is your Substack called?
It's called the Abbey of Misrule.
Okay. So people can find it there. If you were to point to one book at the moment, fiction or nonfiction, that you think that you would want to give out to people that gives them kind of an introduction of who you are and what you do, what would it be?
It's a very good question, isn't it? It might be Beast, my novel that you mentioned. I also have an essay collection called Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist, which is a few years old now, but
Sure.
it talks at some length about all of these kind of ecological and spiritual cultural issues that we've been talking about here.
Well, if you want something more than a book, please check out tacticalfaith.com. He'll be here, a couple of days, but we hope he enjoys it enough and thinks it's strange enough that he comes back one day. But thanks, Paul, for coming on. And again, thank you for what you do. And thank you for just allowing us an opportunity, not only now, but in a few short weeks to come and just spend some time with you.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, man.